Welcome to this week's Parsha, Parsha Vayeishev. Parsha Vayeishev is an amazing sedra, so much in there. The difficulty is to choose some interesting pieces and what not to say. But I've chosen three, I hope, very interesting ideas. The first is the opening of the Parsha. Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Mugurei Aviv be'eretz Canaan. Eila told us Yaakov Yosef, and then the whole story of Yosef begins. Says Rashi famously, in the very beginning of the Sedra, in the second pasuk, Bikesh Yaakov leishev bashalva. Vayeishev Yaakov, when it says that he wanted to dwell, Rashi brings Chazal, which says that Bikesh Yaakov leishev bashalva. He wanted to dwell in serenity. And then Kofatz Olav Roigze Shel Yosef, the whole incident of Yosef, pounced upon him. Tzadikim mevakshim leishev bashalva, continues Rashi, that tzadikim desire to live in peace and serenity. Is it not enough what is prepared for them in the world to come, that they want to have peace and quiet in this world as well? Adkan, the famous Rashi. The question, of course, is, what is wrong with a little bit of peace and quiet? It's something which is very attractive at times. So what exactly is the problem? So there are many mahalchim in this. I just had to look around and there's so many different approaches. So I've just picked out two to share with you. The first is a kliyaka. If you're listening online and you want the handout, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Says the kliyaka, third box on the page. Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Mugurei Aviv be'eretz Canaan. It says the kliyaka, he points out a fascinating thing. The pasuk should have said, it should have been consistent. It says Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Mugurei Aviv. There are two different words there. Vayeishev means to dwell permanently. Mugurei is lashon of gerus, a lashon of ger, of sojourning, a temporary dwelling. Says the kliyaka, Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Yeshivas Aviv. It either should have said, use the word Yeshev, that word twice, consistently, that Yaakov dwelt be'eretz Yeshivas Aviv, Vayogar Yaakov be'eretz Mugurei Aviv, or be consistent and use the second word, i.e. Vayogar Yaakov, he sojourned in this place, in the land of the sojournings of his father. V'oid, so why isn't there consistency? Why do we switch from Vayeishev Yaakov to Mugurei Aviv? Okay, that's question number one. V'oid, and furthermore, be'eretz Canaan lamali, why even mention that? What's the relevance? Elo, lefi, says the kliyaka, shema shemes Yaakov, the Torah is hinting at a certain guilt of Yaakov Avinu, al shebikesh leishev ba'olam hazeh yeshiva shel keva. That Yaakov Avinu at this point was desiring to live in this world a bit too permanently. He was not looking at it as the prosdor that it is, the corridor that gets to the Olam Haba, but he wanted to dwell with a certain degree of kvius, lias k'toishav b'olam hazeh, b'mokum Mugurei Aviv, in a place where his parents, his father Yitzchak, and his grandfather Avram, realized that it's only a transient dwelling place. Ki Aviv lo keinosa, because his father Yitzchak didn't do that. El shehoya ba'olam he was like a traveler who was going from here to there. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Yitzchak in the beginning of Parshas Toldos, Gur ba'aretz hazois. Therefore, his kiloshen gur. Therefore, he was told. Yitzchak was told to sojourn, to be a transient dweller. So therefore, we're told here as well. Lashon of ger, ki rotz HaKadosh Baruch Hu shelo yevakesh yeshiva shel keva b'olam hazeh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want tzadikim to have that permanent dwelling, residence in this world. Al zeh oma be'eretz Canaan, and therefore that's why the pasuk continues be'eretz Canaan. Ba'oisa eretz ho Yitzchak toishav kishelohi. Even though that land, it belonged to Yitzchak. Shekein Oma Avram ger v'toishav anochi emochem im titzra ani ger v'im lo yatlenu min adin. If you want me to sojourn, he says Avram, I'll be a sojourner. And if not, I'm going to take it according to my rights, because it was promised to me by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Im kein gam Yitzchak hayot toishav be'eretz Canaan. So you see that Yitzchak also was a resident in Eretz Canaan. Ki yerusha hi loi, because it was his. So therefore, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu say gur ba'aretz? It's your land, Yitzchak, it belongs to you. But really what the pasuk was saying, and Parsha told us to Yitzchak, was sojourn in this world, Yitzchak. Just, it's your land, but treat it like as if you were a ger. That you shouldn't have a yeshiva shel shalva, sort of a permanent, peaceful, serene residence, even in your own land. Which like the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah, that he travels from here to there. And Yaakov fell short of this lofty standard that was HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Yitzchak to do, and therefore Yaakov fell a bit short. And therefore the whole story of Yosef was sort of thrust upon him. So that's the Kli Yaakav's explanation. Vayeishev Yaakov Eretz Migrei Oviv. The question was not so much about peace and serenity. The question was, Vayeishev, his desire was to be somewhat settled, to be established and settled, in his interaction, his residence in this world was too much of a permanent nature, and really it was against what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Yitzchak of Gur ba'aretz hazos, sojourn in this land, i.e. even though this is your land, but live here as a sort of in a transient way, with an understanding that this is a transient journey and period in your life, and then it's a preparation for Olam Haba, and therefore Yaakov fell a little bit short of that idea and of that aspiration. Okay, that is the Kli Yaakov. Now, the Drash Moshe Feinstein gives a different approach, also a very powerful approach. Pirush Rashi. Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shal v'kofat olav roza shel Yosef. Nira, says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Devada rotz Hashem yisbarach b'shal v'tzadikim. For sure, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is quite happy for tzadikim to enjoy serenity. Shehanoah lohen v'hanoah lo'olam. At the end of the day, if tzadikim are at peace, they have tranquility, they can sit, they can write, they can learn, they can benefit the world. Umi sani de tzadikim d'ochli trei alma, quoting the Gemara in Hurrias Daf Yud, is it despised that tzaddikim can eat both worlds? Let them enjoy this world as well. Says Ramesha, so what was the concern? What was the problem that Yaakov, if you like, fell short of? The issue was one of chinuch, and teaching children. What does that mean? Yaakov thought, I'm past that stage. I don't have to worry so much about the chinuch of my children. Each one of them is outstanding. Therefore, I've done my job. They're now on the paths, the correct paths which they have chosen, and they're tzadikei olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mishtabech b'hem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is delighted with them. The kofsal of roga shel Yosef. HaKadosh Baruch Hu therefore thrust upon him this whole story, the whole matter of Yosef. Even wonderful older children, even tzadikim. Parents cannot turn away from their obligations of chinuch, even from more adult children, even from children who have established themselves as tzadikim, and to educate them and to teach them and to guide them how to behave. Of course, it might be a little different to how you guide younger children and more wayward children, but still, their obligation on the parents never stops. And because Yaakov felt that his obligation had stopped, Olav Roig Shel Yosef. So two very different approaches, but again, many other approaches. But the question, of course, is what's wrong with little peace and quiet? Kli Yaakov says that the concern was the Yaakov Avinu was looking to settle more permanently in a world which is transient, and therefore he was going against the aspiration that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had for his father Yitzchak of Gur ba'aretz hazos, and therefore he was punished. And according to the Drash Moshe, that his punishment was that he took his foot off the gas, as it were, with regard to chinuch, that he felt that he had achieved what he had been raised his children beautifully and properly, and therefore there was nothing else for him to do. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the chinuch never stops. A person's obligation to his children never stops. There's a famous anecdote with a stipler. That the stipler was once approached by someone, I forget exactly the details of the story, but he was asked about the importance of tefillah. And the stipler was trying to convey to this person the importance of davening for the success of your children. And then in a moment of sort of personal candor, he said to the person that you should know I daven for my chaim every day. And at that point, the stipler was an old man, and the stipler was in his early 50s. And he's still, the Reb Chaim was in his early 50s, and yet the stipler was davening for his son, Reb Chaim, who was Gadol, already at that stage in his 50s, new Kol HaTorah Kula even then, and yet the disciple still felt he had an obligation to daven for him. That's exactly the point. Okay, now let's move on. This idea is, the next idea is a phenomenal idea that I came across from my chavrusa. I'll give him credit, Mr. Alan Becker, who married the granddaughter of the person who said it's Rafal David Perlman, and it's a fabulous idea related to this week's Parsha. Let's take a look. Paragraph 2. The Pasuk says, Vayomru ish el achiv hinei bal hachalomas halazed bo. The famous story with Yosef. Yosef is sent by Yaakov to go out to his brothers, and the brothers see him coming and say, Bal hachalomas halazed bo. The dreamer is coming. Va'ata lechu v'nahargehu. Let us go and kill him. V'nashlichu ba'achat haberes, and we'll put him in one of the pits. V'amarnu chaya roach losohu. And they'll say that a wild animal ate him. V'nire ma yuchal mosav, and we'll see what will come of the dreams. Vayishma Reuven vayatzleu miyodam vayomru lo nakel nefesh. And Reuven heard and said, no, let's not kill him. Vayomer aleim Reuven al tishpechu dam. Don't kill him. Hashlichos el habar. Rather put him into the pit. Hazeh asher bamidbar v'yad al tishlechu boy. And don't put your hand on him. Laman hatzil oisei miyodam lahashiv elavu. Because Reuven wanted to return him to his father, to their father, to Yaakov. Okay, now the question is, why is it that Reuven heard and acted, and not others? Rashi says because the ultimate, as the Bechor, the responsibility will fall with him. But the Pasuk seems to say, Vayishma Reuven. What did he hear? What exactly did he hear? The Pasuk doesn't tell us. Vayishma Reuven. Maybe he heard what the brothers were saying. So was he not part of it? What exactly did Reuven? That's what Rashi seems to learn. But what is Pshat Vayishma Reuven? Why is it that Reuven heard and not the others? So, to give some background, we need to go to a Gemara in Tanis, a very interesting Gemara, quite a well-known Gemara in Tanis Daf Chof Aleph Amud Aleph. This is the bottom box on the page. Let's go through the Gemara. Ilfa v'Rabbi Yochanan. Two great people, Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan, two Amoraim, have a garsi ba'iraisa. They would learn Torah together. T'chikulu milsa tuva, and they sat and learned all day, and as a result, they became very poor, very impoverished, and very hard pressed for money. Omri, they said, Nekum v'nezel v'nebut iska. Let us go and engage in business, in commerce, and we unakayim benafshim will fulfill in the pasuk efes kiloya b'cha evyoin, and we'll fulfill the pasuk that there'll be no poor people amongst you, and therefore we'll earn money that we won't become poor. Ozdu they went, Oisivu tute guda re'iyah. And they went and they sat on a shaky, dilapidated wall. Havakab karchi rifta, they were eating bread. Also trei malachi asharis, and two angels came to the place where they were sitting. Shomei Rabbi Yochanan da'amachad lechavrei. Rabbi Yochanan overheard one angel say to the other, Nishte alayu hai guda v'nikdelinu. Let us knock this wall down, it was a shaky wall, and we'll kill them. Why? Because they're abandoning the eternal life of Torah and they're engaging in the temporal life for their own sustenance. The other angel said, Shavkinu, let them be. Why? Because one of them has his time of achievement stands before him. Rabbi Yochanan heard this conversation between the two angels, but Ilfa le shama, Ilfa didn't hear it. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan the Ilfa, shama ma medisa. Rabbi Yochanan, who heard the conversation of the angels, said to Ilfa, did you hear anything just now? Amalei lo. Ilfa said, nope, didn't hear anything. Amas, Rabbi Yochanan said to himself, midishame ana v'ilfa le shama, since I heard and Ilfa didn't hear, shma minale didi kaimeli shaita, must be that my time has come, my time of achievement stands before me. Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara carries on, Rabbi Yochanan said, he said to Ilfa, I'm going back, I'm not going to go now with you on business. Va'uki benafsha, and I'll apply to myself, kilo yechtal evyoin mikerev haaretz. The poor will never cease to exist in your land, and therefore that's my lot. I'm going to go back to the Beis Hamedrash. I'm going to continue learning, and I'll be the lo yechtal evyoin mikerev haaretz. Rabbi Yochanan hoda. Rabbi Yochanan went back to the Beis Hamedrash. Ilfa lo hoda. And Ilfa did not go back. He went on the pathway of business, of commerce. And by the time Ilfa went off on his business trip, by the time he came back, Rabbi Yochanan was already appointed as the Rosh Hashiva, as the next leader of Klal Yisrael. Omrulai, so the other people said to Ilfa, I itiv mar v'goris. If you, Ilfa, would have sat and learned, lo have a molich mar, then, instead, if you would have stayed and learned and gone back to Beis Medrash and not got off on your business ventures, then wouldn't you have been the head of the yeshiva? Wouldn't have you been the Rosh Yeshiva? Ozul tola nafshe ba'askra desfinoso. It says the Gemara, fascinating. Ilfa went and he sort of suspended himself from the mast of the ship. Omar, if anybody asks me a question on any brisa of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Vayeishev, the authors of the brisa, and I don't know the answer, and I'm not going to be able to answer it, resolve the problem from a Mishnah, and I won't be able to resolve the problem, then I will fall from the mast of the ship and I'll be drowned. In other words, Ilfa was saying that I want to. If anyone asks me any question, I've maintained my learning, and if I don't know the answer, then I'm going to throw myself off the ship. Okay, that's the end of the Gemara. Now, it's a very intriguing Gemara. First of all, why did Ilfa climb on top of the mast of a ship to make his announcement? Why didn't he just simply stand in the Beis Medrash or in the public square or some other place? Question number 2, how on earth could Ilfa threaten to kill himself? The Torah forbids this. What's going on over here? So Rabbi David Perlman, like I said, is well known here in London. He's no longer alive, but his his two sons are well known, Rabbi Joseph Perlman and Rabbi Chaim Zundel Perlman, both well known Talmidei Chachomim. Rabbi Joseph Perlman is now made Aliyah and they live in Eretz Yisrael, but Rabbi Perlman is a well known personality here in London, both Talmidei Chachomim. Their late father, Rabbi David Perlman, would say the following: Ilfa felt that this criticism of him was unjust because he was following the path of Torim Derech Eretz. He was following the path of Zvulun, that I can go out and work and still be a tremendous Talmid Chacham. That is my destiny in life. And that's what Rashi says. Rashi says when Ilfa went and sat on top of the mast, Kaloma, and he said, if anyone asks me any question from any brisa, and I'll answer it with a Mishnah, he was demonstrating, Afal Gav de of the Iska, even though I'm involved in business, Garasina Anot Femineh, I've got mastery of the Torah. I haven't forgotten any of my Torah, and I will still be able to master and know all of Torah. Interestingly, the pasuk says, "V'luzvulun," the pasuk in Zois HaBracha, "V'luzvulun Omar smach zvulun b'seisecha v'yisacha bo'elecha." Rashi says in that pasuk, famous Rashi, "Zvulun v'yisacha asu shutfus." They did a partnership. Zvulun lechof yamim mishkein. Zvulun lived on the seashores, on those areas which border the sea. And he would go out to do business with ships, on a ship. And he would earn money. And he would sustain Yisach, who would sit and learn. It says, Smach Zvulun Zvulun comes first because it was the parnosa of Zvulun which would sustain the Torah of Yisacha. Therefore, he gets mentioned first. And Somach Zvulun go be successful when you go out to do business. Interestingly, the word Ilfa in Aramaic means a ship. So it's referring to the fact Ilfa is saying, not that he stood on the top of a mast and was about to commit suicide. No, what he meant was that his involvement in business hadn't interfered with his Torah learning. And he declared that he was prepared to answer any question in Torah that would be posed to him. And if he was unable to answer the question, then he would jump down from the top of the ship, i.e., he would leave his pursuit of business and wealth and abandon his derech of Zvulun, of Torim Derech Eretz, and he would drown himself, as it were, in the Yam Shel Torah, in the Sea of Torah, as Rabbi Yochanan had done. That's what Ilfa was saying. And he was saying that I've chosen a legitimate pathway in life, i.e. Term Derech Eretz. I'm the Zvulun. I've still mastered Torah, and I'm going to go out, and I haven't. This is my destiny in life. And in a way, Ilfa was vindicated, because only Rabbi Yochanan heard from heaven that his destiny was to be the Rosh Hashiva, but Ilfa didn't hear that. Indeed, Rabbi Reuven Margolius in his Margolius Hayom, famous sefer, in the introduction, it's a sefer on Sanhedrin in the Gemara. But in the introduction to the Magolis Hayom, he brings this famous Gemara of Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan, and he suggests that Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan did exactly what they were supposed to do. And Ilfa accomplished no less than Rabbi Yochanan. And therefore that's what Ilfa was doing. He stood on top of the mast of the ship. Not that he was actually going to commit suicide, but he was just demonstrating that his involvement in business had not interfered with his Torah learning, and therefore he demonstrated it by being answered. And the Gemara carries on. He was able to answer the questions that came his way. Okay, now says Rabbi David Palman very beautifully. That's Pshat Vayishma Reuven. So too Reuven, just as Rabbi Yochanan had heard the angels and had returned to Torah, why Ilfa didn't hear, and therefore he pursued business, well, so too, Reuven hears about Yosef, and he hears that's his call to action. And that's the underlying message. The underlying message is that we have to attune our ears and listen out for messages from heaven to help direct us follow the spiritual path in life, which is unique to each and every one of us. And that's really what Vayishma Reuven meant. Sometimes there are calls from heaven that are targeted on a specific individual. Sometimes A can hear, but B and C won't hear, because A is meant to hear that. So Vayishma Reuven, this is your call to action. This is what you're meant to be doing. Rabbi Yochanan heard the call to action that you are meant to be the Rosh Hashiva. And therefore he went back to the Beis HaMedrash. Ilfa didn't hear it because that was not his destiny in life. That's Pshat Vayishma Reuven. Very geschmack. Rabbi David Palman. One short final idea, and this is just a very short point. Another famous episode in this week's Parsha is Yehuda and Tamar. After the whole story of the sale of Yosef, the Parsha discusses the whole incident where Yehuda marries his daughter-in-law, and that is really the beginning of the story of Moshiach. Well, it's the next chapter, if you like, in the story of Moshiach. Now, for those of you who learn Oraisa, which I proudly do, which is a fabulous limud, and we've just finished Seder Moed, and we started Seder Noshim, and we started with Yevomis. So it's a good quiz question. How does the story of Yehuda and Tamar, how does it feature in Yevomis Daf Beis Omid Aleph? Good question. So I'll share with you a fascinating answer. You see, one of the questions that the Rishonim deal with in Yevomis at the very beginning is, why is Yevomis now? Why is it the beginning of Seder Noshim? If I would have organized the six or the Shisha Sidra Mishnah, I would have said, okay, you want to put Noshim after Moed, then great. But why start with Yevomis? It's particularly difficult. But also you've got other more sort of fundamental Kiddushin and Gittin and Ksubas. Why aren't they before Yevomis? So the answer is addressed by many of the Rishonim, and the Tosis Rishonim, which appears on the actual Omid, on Daf Beis, on every Omid, but on Beis Omid Aleph, he addresses this question, and it's going to have reference to our Sedra. Let's take a look. This is the bottom box on the second sheet. This is the Tosis Rishonim on Yevomis Daf Beis Omid Aleph. And this is the famous opening Mishnah. There are 15 Yevomis, which I'm not going to go into. They patter the Torah, whatever that means. Yesh Makshim. And my maschal say the Noshim b'Yevomis. Why does Noshim, the second Seder of the Mishnah, the third Seder, you got Zroim, but then you've got Moed, which is the main, there's only Brachas in Zroim, but then you've got Moed, and then Noshim follows it. Why? Why does it begin? My maschal say the Noshim b'Yevomis. Why does Noshim begin with Yevomis? On the contrary, you shouldn't begin with Peronius. Peronius means the whole context of Yevomis, of Yibum, is a very sad one, because it means someone died without children, and that's Peronius. That's a very negative, sad situation where you're talking about a death of a person who died without children, and therefore Peronius and Maskalinon, we don't generally begin with sad things. Surely it would have been more appropriate to start with Kiddushin, which is a very joyous occasion. People are getting married, and then Ksubas, which deals with the marriage contracts and the financial provision for the wife, and then you follow on with Gittin, Rahman Islam, if there's a necessary for her to have a get, and then you talk about Yevomis. Why is Yevomis at the beginning? So he gives a few answers. Venira, Mishum Dichsiv, the first answer is, it says in the Pasuk, V'hoy be'emunas itecha chaysin yeshus v'omru. Chazal famously dash in this Pasuk can say, Itechel zeh Seder Moed, chaysin zeh Seder Noshim, v'imkein Seder Noshim hu bossa Seder Moed. The Pasuk tells us that Noshim has got to follow Seder Moed. It's a Messiah Maseches Moed Kotan. Now, although we finish with Chagiga, that there are different orders of it, but others have the sequence of Moed Katan being at the very end of Seder Moed, and Moed Katan deals with Alvelus, David Pironiosa, which is sad, dangerous, negative situations. Lokach Hischil Seder Noshim b'Maseches Yevamos, and therefore that's the thematic connection, that you finish with Moed Katan, which is Peronius, you then go to Yevamos, which is also Peronius, or Masmich Peronius and Peronius, you juxtapose the two Peronius together. Kedomin Perek Hashutfin, like the Gemara says in Baba Basra in Hashutfin, the Masmich Melachim, the Sofi Peronius, Lirime, the Kule Peronius. When the Gemara there in the beginning of Yevamos, in the beginning of Baba Basra, goes through the orders of Tanakh, why each Sefer is in the correct place, it says that you have Melachim, and then you have Yirmiyah next in Nevi'im, following Melachim. Why? Because the end of Melachim is Peronius, talks about the sad, tragic times of Klal Yisrael. The Yirmiyah is also Peronius, so therefore, thematically, it's juxtaposed, and therefore, that's why Yevamos goes to the beginning of Seder Noshim, because the Pasuk tells us it's got to follow Moed. The end of Moed is Moed Katan, which is sad, and therefore you begin with Yevamos, which also has a sad backstory. Inami, an alternative pshat, Mefarish Tchila Eza Isha Asura Ve'eza Isha Muteres. First of all, you've got to lay out which women is a person able to marry and which is he not able to marry. And then you can start talking about Kiddushin. Before you start talking about the actual Kiddushin, the Maisa Kiddushin, how you marry a woman, you've got to know who are you able to marry. So therefore Yevamos comes first. That's the second answer. Now, here comes the third answer, which is related to this week's Edra. Because this is the first mitzvah that is given to women, recorded in the Torah. Because it says because in this week's Parsha it says come to the wife of your brother and do yibum. So you have a reference to yibum. This is the first reference to a mitzvah in the Torah, and since it's the first mitzvah for a woman recorded in the Torah, therefore it appears first in Seder Noshim. So that is the answer to our quiz question. How is Yehuda and Tamar, this week's Sedra, related to Yevamos Daf Beis Amud Aleph? Because it's one of the answers the Tosfos Shonim gives to explain why Yevamos comes before the other Masechtas in Noshim, because it's the first mitzvah that appears for women in Torah, and therefore it should go at the beginning of Seder Noshim. So there we have it. Three very interesting ideas in this week's Parsha. Why is it Vayeishev Yaakov, famously Bikesh Yaakov Leishev B'Shalva? What's wrong with a bit of peace and quiet? Two Mahalchim we said today, the Kliyaka and the Drash Moshe Feinstein, and then we had the beautiful piece of Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan, the famous Gemara in Tanis, how come Vayishma Reuven? Well, just like Vayishma Rabbi Yochanan, just like Rabbi Yochanan heard and Ilfa didn't hear, well, so too Vayishma Reuven. That a person, that Reuven heard his call to action in the same way that Rabbi Yochanan did as well. And we also have to attune our ears and listen to messages from heaven to direct our spiritual path in life. And lastly, the Tosfos Shonim has just described why Yehuda and Tamar, how they feature from this week's Sedra, why Yevamos comes at the very beginning of Seder Noshim.